Hello and welcome. So this whole Bridgerton debacle, how they bungled adapting season 3 from the books to the TV show, kind of got me thinking about another kind of failed adaptation from earlier this year, or perhaps it was last year. It was the highly anticipated Disney adaptation of Percy Jackson. In the lead up to the premiere of that show, I was still on Twitter and the excitement was fever pitch. I actually reread the first book because I didn't want to miss out on all the fun. Anyway, in today's video, I kind of want to revisit the TV show, talk a bit about what I felt went wrong, and compare it a bit to the book and the movie, which in retrospect wasn't so bad. If you don't know the story, Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief is the first in a series of books about the adventures of 12-year-old Percy Jackson, who just so happens to be a demigod. As a son of a human mother and the Greek god of the sea, Poseidon, Percy and his friends Annabeth, daughter of Athena, and Grover, a satyr, set out on a quest to retrieve Zeus's stolen lightning bolt from the underworld. It extra sucks for Percy that Zeus and his father are in a spat, and Zeus suspects that Percy is the one who stole it, and Zeus has been sending monsters after Percy. Escaping these monsters and making their way to the underworld in one piece, well, that is the main adventure of book 1 and season 1 of the show. Obviously, a big part of the excitement for the show for the fans was that the show was a do-over of the movie adaptation, which everybody believed was a disaster back then. The movie came out around 2010 and the sequel in 2013, and the 2010s in general were a boon for fans of young adult dystopia, sci-fi, fantasy, and mythology. We had the Harry Potter movies, the Twilight series, Hunger Games, Divergent. There were also a couple of Greek mythology movies. There was the Henry Cavill one and the Sam Worthington one. So yeah, it was a time. And sure, the movies did make some money, but they were so dramatically different from the books and didn't really capture the essence of the story and the characters that they were wildly unpopular with fans. Add to that, the author Rick Riordan was also quite vocal about not being a fan of the movie, so a third movie that had been planned was scrapped. These movies did sometimes feel like a quick, we need another Harry Potter moneymaker, and it showed in some of the creative decisions. Even though, as I said, looking back, they weren't the worst. There were one or two parts of the movies that I actually thought they did better than the book and the show. More on that in a bit. So yeah, a lot was riding on the show, and when it was announced that the author of the books was heavily involved in the Disney reboot, you can imagine expectations were at an all-time high. The stage was set for success. Fast forward some months and we finally get the much anticipated reboot, and it's okay. Actually, it starts out kind of okay and promising, but it kind of goes all downhill from there. To start, the episodes were fairly short. So in 30 minutes of the first episode, we meet Percy, we learn about his troubled home and school life, we find out that he's a demigod, he loses his mom, he uses a sword to fight a fury and a minotaur, and yeah, that's a lot. Pretty intense and overwhelming for a kid who has been told his whole life that he had an overactive imagination. Suddenly, all of this is real for him, and not only that, he's smack in the middle of it as a key player. You would think that this sounds like a great build-up of discovery and adventure, and you're going to be hooked and ready to go along for the ride, but episode 1 felt less like I was being propelled into this great adventure and more like plodding along with no real sense of danger or fun. This is only episode 1 though, so maybe there's room for improvement. There's this scene where Percy is almost attacked by Mrs. Dodds on the field trip, and she appears, threateningly flies over him, and he doesn't really react in the moment. But who knows, maybe after years of seeing things, he thought that this was another figment of his imagination, or maybe he froze in the moment, unable to react. But given that this is the first action scene of the episode, the one that pretty much opens us to this other whole world, it's fairly short and underwhelming. I mean, in the book, Percy is so terrified in this moment that he's shaking and he almost drops his sword. In the movie, Percy is first of all horrified that his teacher has turned into this creature. He's running, you hear him yell out, he trips and he falls trying to escape. It's a fun, adrenaline-filled moment. Mrs. Dodds as the Fury is terrifying, but equally and even more impressively scary is Mr. Brunner telling her that he'll rip her to pieces. And even though he's in the chair and she's this monster, you kind of believe him somehow. On the show, in a blink and you'll miss it moment, Percy silently uses the sword to get rid of her, and he's not actually wielding the sword. It looks like it just happens, and it's not a very notable moment. And they don't really use this moment to move the story forward because Mr. Brunner and Grover obviously pretend like this never happened, which is true to the books, but Percy not only accepts what they tell him, he's not the least bit curious or suspicious. There's supposed to be some creeping feeling that something's afoot, that they're lying to him. Percy should feel that this monster was different. because it is. In the book, this attack does cause Percy to come apart quite a bit. He has sleepless nights, his marks at school are slipping, he becomes even more suspicious when he overhears Grover and Mr. Brunner's conversation about him. Bits and pieces of the truth are kind of being revealed, but we still have questions. On the show, we get a pretty boring information dump when Percy's mom just sits him on the couch basically and tells him that his dad is a god, and she reveals that all the stories she told him from when he was a kid about the Greek myths are actually true. It's a flat scene with mostly one-way dialogue, and I thought to myself, well, that's a really boring way to find out that your dad is a god. We get more bad exposition then in the car between Percy and Grover, where Percy's still remarkably calm about all of this, and this scene doesn't adequately convey that A, they're in danger in this moment, and B, the fast pace of the scene. We know that they're in a rush to get to Camp Half-Blood, but because Percy and Grover are kind of having a chill conversation and Percy has time to think in the car, it slows things down. And this is how the scene is described in the book. We tore through the night along dark country roads. Wind slammed against the Camaro. Rain lashed the windshield. I didn't know how my mom could see anything, but she kept her foot on the gas. Percy has so many questions at this point, but Grover and Sally are way too busy trying to get him to safety, and Grover says there's no time to explain right now in the moment. So in the book, we as a reader, again, are left in a little bit of suspense along with Percy wanting to know the full story. Before we get to the actually decent Minotaur scene, let's talk about Riptide, Percy's pen sword. Only because I wanted to include the kind of iconic it's a pen scene from the movie. Percy in the movies was so good, and it's one of the few moments where I think that the movie handled it better than the show and the book. It was fun to see movie Percy's reaction of utter disbelief when he wielded it for the first time. I get that TV show Percy already used it on Mrs. Dodds, but not seeing him the least bit fazed by it, I don't know, it takes some of the fun of the discovery out of it. Percy just doesn't seem fazed by anything. Still, even though this kid kind of feels like he's taking it all in his stride, the actual fight with the Minotaur isn't bad. One issue I have, and this counts for most of the characters throughout the season really, is the lack of sound effects during the action scenes. There's very little screaming or yelling, not a lot of grunts of exertion, no crying out in pain when they fall. I get that movie Percy is a little bit older, and so maybe he could handle those scenes a little bit, the physical scenes, but still. In episode 2, we get to meet the first of the gods, Dionysus, and he's the god of wine and pleasure. This casting felt so gimmicky because while I love Jason Mizukis, he's just kind of playing himself as the kooky, good time drinking guy. Well, it seems to be the role that he always goes for, and it took me out of the show a little bit because to me it was just Jason Mizukis. Anyway, I'm going to forgive Percy for his too measured and sarcastic reaction to seeing that his teacher, his wheelchair-bound teacher, is actually a centaur, because the poor kid has been through it at this point. We also meet Annabeth, who is adorably assertive and smart, but I did much prefer her introduction in the movies. Seeing the daughter of Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, in action was pretty cool, and there wasn't much in the show that made me feel like this was the daughter of Athena, if you know what I mean. If anything, she felt like Hermione to me, but sometimes slightly meaner and impatient, whereas Hermione was more of a competitive know-it-all. In the book, Annabeth points out to Percy that he's injured and that he should quickly get back in the water, guessing that it would heal his wounds, and in the show, she catches him off guard by just pushing him into the creek. It's a minor complaint, but I didn't like it because I kind of thought that show Annabeth was a little bit too grumpy already. The push just felt kind of mean and it wasn't a good choice. Still, she's much better than the way that they wrote Grover for the show. It was disappointing to see how they stripped him of what made him a great and valuable sidekick in the books. He's a goat after all, so he's nervous bleating, eating random things, his reed pipes. In the show, he's just a kid with goat legs, and I sometimes thought that they forgot that he was meant to be a satyr. And I don't know, I don't want to pick on the kids too much because they are kids, but we can blame the writing, I guess, as well. It's not great. Episode 3 puts the kids on the road, and we get a quite boring memory of Percy being scared of swimming, and there's a lot of exposition dialogue, which is going to be my complaint throughout the season. Which is kind of crazy that it's boring, because Greek mythology is meant to be interesting, and I kind of wish that they'd found more creative ways to tell some of the story, rather than just having the kids talking the whole time. The scene on the bus is the first action scene of this episode, and what I was expecting from the scene was something similar to the scene in Harry Potter, and I think it was the Order of the Phoenix, where the Dementors attack Harry and Dudley in the tunnel. The rainstorm, the eeriness of the lightning in the dark tunnel. This is kind of what I imagined when I read it in the Percy Jackson book, with the bus going under the Lincoln Tunnel, everything going dark, the Furies attacking, and of course the bus driver trying to keep control of the bus and the other passengers screaming. Sure, it's a kid's book, so it can't be outright scary, but it could be a little eerie. In the TV show, this is all in broad daylight, and the scene doesn't actually really count as an action scene. We get a few minutes of a Fury just having a full-on conversation with Annabeth, and there's not much more to it. It's over pretty quickly when they jump out of the window and we cut to them walking in the forest. We do get a good scene with Annabeth throwing a knife at one of the Furies though. So when the kids are walking in the forest, we're supposed to feel this sense of relief that they've just made it out of danger. Maybe they're out of breath, but finally the coast is clear. But because there wasn't much danger, the tension in the previous scene wasn't really there, we don't get that. It's just more talking. I will say that through all of this, Annabeth was really brave and on top of things, and I trusted her to keep the boys safe. Anyway, no matter, because we have a little action scene with Medusa coming up, right? Well, wrong. The kids go into Medusa's home, and extra disappointing here is that Grover doesn't warn them not to go in. He tells Percy that he's so hungry, he's willing to take the risk and he wants to eat the food. What? Now remember, Grover's supposed to be Percy's protector, but so far on the show, he's just more a companion, and they lost a great opportunity to show that Grover can be brave and that he has some good instincts, and he also helps fight Medusa. On the show, he flies off because he can't use the shoes. He misses the whole Medusa fight, and he only comes back when Percy is about to behead Medusa, which, by the way, was also too easy. No running, no ducking. Medusa just stands there. She's distracted by Grover, and then Percy goes for it. That's it. The rest of the episode is more talking, and then they send Medusa's head off to Mount Olympus. In episode 4, we meet the mother of monsters, and she just kept talking. First of all, the first half of this episode is dialogue, but things do pick up a little bit when the kids run through the train trying to get away, and Percy eventually does try to fight a chimera, but at the end of the episode, he obviously falls. One good thing is that between episodes 4 and 5, we do see that Grover, while he fails at being comic relief or, really useful, he is kind of the glue that keeps Annabeth and Percy and the whole group together, because they tend to butt heads, the two of them. I'm glad that they also soften Annabeth's character a little bit, and she starts to see Percy as a friend and grows to care for him, but she's still Annabeth, so she's a little bit prickly about it. It's kind of awkward, but it's certainly better than the nonsense romance that they had in the first movie, and also better than the crush that she had on Luke in the books. Episode 5 is by far my least favorite of the lot. I even dreaded rewatching it for this video. It's mostly dialogue. The kids are chatting to Ares in the diner. Grover stays behind chatting to Ares while Annabeth and Percy go off to retrieve his shield, and it's mostly dialogue again. More talking when Hephaestus appears as well. End of episode. Thank goodness. But wait, we know what comes after this, right? It's the Lotus Casino. That ought to be fun. Well, no, we're out of luck for that as well. The kids get to Vegas and they know not to eat anything in the casino, so there are no shenanigans. Instead, Grover goes off on a side mission looking for Pan, and it involves a lot of talking, and Percy and Annabeth lose time because they bump into Hermes, and he distracts them by talking to them. So much of the show is just bogged down by so much dialogue. Why can't they let these kids have any fun? Where is the adventure? Interestingly enough, on the show, Hermes keeps them talking so long that they end up altogether missing the summer solstice deadline. This is interesting because in the book, they're in the casino for 5 days, also distracted, and by the time they're done, they still have 1 day to the summer solstice and to complete their quest. So this deadline, it ramps up the urgency, and the stakes are pretty high at this point. They have 1 day left to complete their quest, or Zeus is going to declare war. It was such a baffling choice to me to have the kids altogether miss their deadline on the show, because you're like, oh, well then, we've missed the deadline. There is no race against the clock. Percy still manages to get passage to the underworld. What did the clock even matter? Because it looks like there's not going to be any war, right? Anyway, the finale, I'm sad to say, is more of the same. Percy and Ares have a pretty underwhelming fight while Grover and Annabeth stand by. We get to see Percy use his power properly against Ares, but he basically just causes one big wave that crashes over him, and then it's pretty much done. Ares declares him an enemy, and he disappears. And let me repeat that. It's just one single wave that takes Ares down. Anyway, Percy makes it to Mount Olympus, and it's so wonderful to see Lance Reddick as Zeus, and it's heartbreaking to be reminded of his loss. I don't even mind that he is the last person I think of when I think of Zeus, but his suit is impeccable. I actually think that the movie got Zeus and Poseidon right, and as cheesy as it might seem a little bit, the opening scene, seeing Poseidon in his real size, in his element, come out of the sea, it was pretty cool. So on the show, on Olympus, Percy meets his father when Poseidon defends him from being struck down by Zeus. But this is how their meeting is described in the book, when Percy walks into the throne room with 12 thrones that are all empty except 2. His throne was a deep-sea fisherman's chair. It was the simple swiveling kind, with a black leather seat and a built-in holster for a fishing pole. Instead of a pole, the holster held a bronze trident, flickering with green light around the tips. The guards weren't moving or speaking, but there was tension in the air, as if they'd just finished an argument. I approached the fisherman's throne and knelt at his feet. Father, I dared not look up. My heart was racing. I could feel the energy emanating from the two guards. If I said the wrong thing, I had no doubt they could blast me into dust. To my left, Zeus spoke. Should you not address the master of this house first, boy? I kept my head down and waited. This to me felt like a fitting way for Percy to meet his father Poseidon on Mount Olympus. There's a definite change in atmosphere. You can feel how important this scene is. Percy knows where he is, and I like the fact that he knelt before the gods. It was an excellent scene in the book. Anyway, his father is distant at first, but I also really like the final conversation in the book between Percy and his father. Your mother is a queen among women, Poseidon said wistfully. I had not met such a mortal woman in 1,000 years. Still, I am sorry you were born, child. I have brought you a hero's fate, and a hero's fate is never happy. It is never anything but tragic. There was a different light in his eyes, a fiery kind of pride. You did well, Perseus. Do not misunderstand me. Whatever else you do, know that you are mine. You are a true son of the sea god. So you see what I mean? Like, the weight of this moment in the show was just kind of missing because Poseidon's in a rush to get Percy back to Earth. He doesn't really say much to him. And Percy, he reacts the same way he reacts to everything, really. Just, being Percy. One of the better parts of the show, I guess, so it wasn't bad, was when Percy goes back to camp and we get the Luke reveal, that Luke is the friend that would betray Percy. The kid who plays Luke is one of the better actors, and maybe it's because he's a little bit older, but Percy does have better chemistry with him than he does with Annabeth or Grover. Anyway, eventually the kids say goodbye to each other and they agree to meet back at camp next year. And yeah, Percy is reunited with his mom. As you can see, it was disappointing. I don't know if they've announced season 2 yet. I'll definitely be tuned in. And anyway, if you're a fan of the show, if you're a fan of the books, what did you think of this adaptation? Anyway, yeah, that's it for this video, and thank you for watching.